happened to Summer?
No.
Do you know who took Summer?
No.
Home when you first come home.
I'm not doing all that. I'm not doing all of that. I can't do this.
So listen, they're trying to help. They're trying to help.
It's not out with me.
They might.
There's nothing more to remember. I gotta go home.
10 minutes ago, the internet seemed to erupt all at once with one explosive claim that Summer Wells' mother, Candus Bly, has finally confessed. In real time, social media platforms lit up like wildfire. Within minutes, YouTube channels were going live, Facebook groups were reposting the same screenshots, and Twitter threads were filling with comments that all carried the same shocking headline: "The truth is finally out." The idea spread with terrifying speed. A single phrase in an interview, an emotional reaction on camera, a clip taken out of context. Suddenly, it wasn't just an interview anymore, it was being branded as the confession people had been waiting for since June 2021, the day 5-year-old Summer disappeared from her home in Hawkins County, Tennessee. People were quick to believe it. For many who have followed the case for years, every word Candus speaks is weighed, dissected, and debated. To them, this moment, this alleged confession, felt like the missing piece of the puzzle. Comment sections flooded instantly. She finally admitted it. "We knew it all along. Justice is coming." But here's where it gets complicated. No law enforcement agency has announced such a confession. There has been no press conference, no official statement, nothing new in the official record of this case. What we're witnessing isn't a legal breakthrough. It's a viral wave of perception built on the power of repetition. A headline is shared, it's reposted, it's quoted, and before long, it feels like fact. And that's what makes this so powerful. Across platforms, the claim looks the same: bold, shocking, final. Candus confessed. But when you trace it back, what people are actually sharing isn't a new revelation at all. It's old footage, old interviews, clips we've seen before, suddenly framed in a new way. For example, in one of her interviews, Candus insists, "I didn't do anything to my daughter." To many, that's a denial, a straightforward statement of innocence. But when replayed with ominous music, captions, and commentary, the very same sentence is now being called suspicious, even twisted into an admission. Online sleuths argue the way she said it, her tone, her pauses, her body language, all of it points not to innocence, but to guilt. So when you see the internet explode with a headline like this, what you're actually watching is a kind of trial by public opinion. A single phrase is taken, reinterpreted, and then repeated until it feels like a confession, even if the words themselves deny any wrongdoing. The result? Thousands of people are now convinced that Candus Bly has admitted something, when in reality, she has never once said the words people are claiming. But what did Candus Bly actually say? That's the question echoing across social media right now. In clip after clip, people are pointing to the same moments: a pause too long, a shaky voice, eyes looking away from the camera, and claiming it's all evidence of guilt. Yet when you go back and listen carefully, the words themselves aren't a confession at all. Candus doesn't say, "I hurt Summer." She doesn't admit to covering anything up. What she does say is filled with emotion, defensiveness, and grief. But for an audience already suspicious, those emotions are exactly what fuel the theory. To some, her words sound like denial. To others, they sound like a slip, an admission buried under stress and pressure. This is where the debate turns explosive. On one side are those who argue that Candus is a grieving mother, speaking through shock and trauma, and that her awkward pauses or defensive tone are simply the raw pain of someone unfairly targeted. On the other side are those who insist that every hesitation is calculated, that every glance away from the camera is a tell, and that silence itself can be louder than words. And that's why so many are convinced. They're not just listening to what she says, they're analyzing how she says it. The trembling in her voice, the lack of eye contact, the nervous body language. To some viewers, these are the cracks in the mask, the signals of hidden guilt. Tonight, we're not just replaying those interviews, we're breaking them down. We'll look at the body language that has fueled countless YouTube breakdowns. We'll listen to the exact phrases that people are calling the confession. And most importantly, we'll ask, is this really proof of guilt, Or is it an illusion created by suspicion, frustration, and years of unanswered questions? Because in the end, this so-called confession may not be a confession at all, but rather the world projecting its own fears and theories onto the voice of a mother who has already lost everything. In interview after interview, Candus Bly has repeated the same phrase, "I didn't do anything to my daughter." At first glance, it sounds like the most natural thing a mother in her position would say. What else could she say? Her daughter vanished without a trace, and ever since, she has lived under a cloud of suspicion. The simple declaration, "I didn't do anything," should be enough to settle doubts. It should paint her as a mother desperate to be heard, desperate to clear her name. But that's not how the public has taken it. Instead, the internet has twisted those words into something far darker. Online forums, YouTube breakdowns, and even body language experts all replay that moment over and over, listening not just to the words, but to how they were said. The tone, the hesitation, the repetition. To many, it doesn't sound like a mother firmly denying involvement. It sounds like someone trying to convince herself. The more she says it, the less certain it seems. As if the words aren't meant for the cameras at all, but whispered reminders to ease her own conscience. And this is where the case takes on a dangerous life of its own. When facts are scarce, when a child disappears and investigators release little to the public, people turn to psychology, to interpretation, to gut feelings. They take every sigh, every pause, every choice of phrasing, and analyze it like evidence in a courtroom. Suddenly, a grieving mother's denial transforms into the very thing it was never meant to be, a supposed confession in disguise. Because here's the hard truth. In high-profile cases like this, denial doesn't always equal innocence in the court of public opinion. Sometimes, the very act of saying, "I didn't do it," becomes ammunition for the opposite belief. To her defenders, Candus is simply repeating herself because she feels cornered, because people won't stop pointing fingers. But to critics, every repetition sounds rehearsed, defensive, and almost scripted. It's a lose-lose situation. Stay silent, and people say you're hiding something. Speak out, and every word is dissected until the meaning is lost. This is the storm Candus Bly finds herself in. A storm where her words no longer belong to her. They belong to the internet, to strangers, to thousands of people piecing together their own theories about what happened to Summer Wells. On social media, countless commenters argue that guilt leaks out in ways people can't control. They look for the micro-expressions, the shaky breathing, the darting eyes. They argue that the truth doesn't always come in what's said, but in what's left unsaid. And that's why Candus's statement has become so infamous. Not because of what she declared, but because of what people think it reveals between the lines. This isn't new in true crime. We've seen it before. Parents or family members of missing children giving emotional interviews, only to be picked apart endlessly. In some cases, those suspicions proved tragically accurate. In others, they destroyed innocent people who were already suffering. The line between truth and perception becomes razor thin. And Candus now stands right in the middle of it. So what do we really have here? A mother loudly proclaiming her innocence? Or a guilty conscience slipping through the cracks? That's the haunting question her words leave behind. And it's why, years later, those same interviews are still played back, studied, and debated like pieces of unsolved evidence. Because in the mystery of Summer Wells, sometimes it feels like the words we do have are just as puzzling as the silence surrounding what really happened that day. Even experts have pointed to her tone, her downward glances, and the way her voice seems to break at the most critical moments. To the untrained eye, these might look like nothing more than the natural reactions of a mother under unimaginable pressure. After all, if your child vanished and you were suddenly at the center of a nationwide media storm, wouldn't your voice crack? Wouldn't your eyes look down in exhaustion, shame, or even despair? But to body language specialists, investigators, and thousands of people watching online, these subtle cues take on a very different meaning. They aren't seen as harmless reactions to grief, but as signals, silent indicators that perhaps not everything being spoken out loud matches the truth being carried inside. Psychologists have a word for this: leakage. It's the idea that when someone is holding back the truth, their body finds ways to betray them, often in tiny, almost invisible gestures. A twitch of the mouth, a break in tone, a refusal to look someone in the eye. To an analyst, these details speak volumes. And that's exactly why many people continue to ask the same haunting question: are we really watching a grieving mother or a guilty one? When Candus shifts in her seat during interviews, avoids prolonged eye contact, or hesitates before giving an answer, critics latch onto those pauses as though they're puzzle pieces in a much larger and much darker story. For them, it isn't just about the sentences she forms, it's about the way those sentences are delivered. The flat, sometimes emotionless tone. The defensive outbursts when pressed. The moments where she seems more frustrated at being questioned than devastated by her daughter's disappearance. To many, these are red flags, signs of someone carrying the weight of a hidden truth. And then there was the moment that set social media ablaze: the walk-off. In one interview, when the questions grew too pointed, Candus got up and walked away from the camera. For her, maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the breaking point. The moment when the emotional toll simply became too heavy to carry under the spotlight. But to thousands of viewers at home, it was confirmation of what they had already suspected. They didn't see a heartbroken mother protecting her peace. They saw someone slipping under the pressure, someone cracking, someone who might be hiding what really happened to Summer Wells. The internet magnified that moment instantly. Clip after clip circulated on YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook, with creators slowing down her movements, replaying her downward glances, and pointing out the exact second her body seemed to betray her words. To the public, her silence in those moments was louder than anything she had spoken. Because when she walked away, she didn't just avoid the cameras, she left behind the image of someone unable to withstand the truth closing in. And once those narratives take hold online, they're almost impossible to undo. Every time Candus appeared in another interview, whether with local news stations or on national shows like Dr. Phil, the cycle repeated. Her words were dissected. Her gestures slowed down and analyzed. Every sigh, every tear, every glance away from the camera was turned into evidence. Evidence not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, where suspicion grows faster than facts and where silence often counts as guilt. So when she said, "I didn't do anything to my daughter," it didn't land as the reassurance she may have intended. Instead, for countless viewers, it rang hollow. Some even described it as the kind of statement someone guilty might use, a phrase less about proving innocence and more about trying to convince themselves. Online discussions spiraled into theories, with commenters claiming her tone was flat, her eyes avoided contact, and her body carried stress that no words could erase. Even those who tried to defend her faced backlash. Because for every person who sees a grieving mother caught in an impossible situation, there are dozens more who see hesitation, avoidance, and what they believe is guilt disguised as pain. And when she walked away from questions, that divide grew even deeper. Her defenders said, "She's had enough. No one can take that kind of pressure forever." But her critics doubled down. That's not exhaustion. That's someone who can't keep her story straight. In the end, it's moments like these that keep the case of Summer Wells alive in the public's imagination. Because without clear answers from law enforcement, without a confession or a suspect, people look for truth in the smallest of details. And when the world watches a mother's voice break, her eyes drop, or her feet carry her out of frame, the interpretation of those actions becomes almost as important as the words themselves. On that June afternoon in rural Tennessee, Candus Bly says it started as just another ordinary day. According to her account, little Summer Wells had been outside, barefoot as always, playing in the yard with her brothers and enjoying the freedom of the family's hilltop property. Then, Candus says she told Summer to come inside. And here's where the story takes its most haunting turn. Candus has repeated in multiple interviews that Summer walked through the door of their home, went downstairs into the basement where her toys were kept, and began to play. Candus insists she watched her daughter head down those steps, never imagining it would be the last time she'd ever see her. Just minutes later, Candus says she called out for Summer. No answer. She says she checked the rooms, searched upstairs, then down again into the basement, but her little girl had vanished. According to Candus, what followed was a frantic scramble. She says she called her mother, searched around the property, and then called Don, Summer's father, before finally dialing 911. But to this day, the details of those crucial minutes remain shrouded in confusion, contradiction, and doubt. For some, this version of events seems straightforward. A child walked into her home and was gone. For others, it raises impossible questions. How could a 5-year-old disappear from inside her own house, in broad daylight, with family nearby? How could no one see or hear a thing? And this is why so many people look back at Candus's words, her tone, her pauses, her repeated insistence, as more than just testimony. To them, they are clues. Clues that either reveal the truth of a sudden, unthinkable abduction, or point to something much darker, hidden behind a mother's trembling voice. What followed was one of the most extraordinary mobilizations in Tennessee history. From the moment that 911 call went out on June 15, 2021, Hawkins County transformed overnight into the epicenter of a desperate manhunt for a missing child. Law enforcement descended on the rolling hills, bringing with them every resource imaginable. Helicopters thundered above, their searchlights cutting through the thick summer haze. Ground crews combed through ridges and ravines, battling snakes, briars, and the suffocating Appalachian humidity. Dive teams swept through ponds and streams, methodically searching every inch of water where a small child might have wandered. And then there were the volunteers. Hundreds of ordinary citizens left behind their jobs, their farms, their daily lives to scour the land. They brought ATVs, horses, drones, even their own search dogs. For weeks, Hawkins County became a community united by a single goal: to find Summer Wells. The operation grew so large that it quickly became one of the biggest search efforts the state of Tennessee had ever witnessed. Crews fanned out for miles. Nothing was left unchecked. Old barns, abandoned trailers, culverts, caves, drainage ditches, every possible hiding place was inspected. Searchers cut through thick undergrowth and waded through muddy creeks. Neighbors reported hearing the buzzing of helicopters day and night, as if the sky itself was refusing to rest until Summer was found. And yet, through all of this, not a single piece of evidence emerged. Not a shoe, not a shred of clothing, not even a footprint in the mud. For investigators, it was as though Summer had simply vanished into thin air. For the community, that silence was haunting. How could a 5-year-old disappear so completely, without leaving behind even the faintest trace of where she had gone? Candus Bly, Summer's mother, remained in the middle of this storm. Cameras followed her, reporters sought her out, and her words were broadcast to millions. From the very beginning, she made one thing clear: she denied having anything to do with her daughter's disappearance. Standing before cameras, often with her husband Don Wells by her side, she repeated the same phrase time and time again: "I had nothing to do with this. I would never hurt my daughter." To Candus, this was her attempt to silence the whispers, to push back against the growing wave of suspicion. But the effect was the opposite. Instead of reassurance, her repeated denials seemed to stir more questions. The more often she said she had nothing to do with it, the more it sounded, at least to some, like a scripted defense, a rehearsed line spoken too many times. Viewers online latched onto her tone, her phrasing, and most of all, the way she carried herself in those interviews. They claimed her body language betrayed her. They noted the downward glances, the way her voice sometimes trembled, and how her hands fidgeted. Was this the sound of a grieving mother? Or was it the uneasy performance of someone hiding a dark truth? Clips of her interviews spread across YouTube and Facebook like wildfire. Amateur sleuths dissected them frame by frame. Some pointed to her facial expressions as evidence of deception. Others zoomed in on her posture or analyzed the way she blinked when answering certain questions. Entire forums filled with speculation. Was she really telling the truth? Or was she covering something up? For many in the public, it wasn't just about what Candus said, it was about how she said it. The tone struck people as flat in some moments, oddly defensive in others, and then emotional only when certain topics were raised. To skeptics, this wasn't the raw anguish of a mother in crisis. It was inconsistent, and inconsistency meant suspicion. And then there were the moments where she simply walked away. At one point, during a particularly tense exchange with a reporter, Candus appeared frustrated and cut the interview short. For critics, this was damning. They didn't see a mother overwhelmed by grief. They saw someone who couldn't hold her story together under pressure. Someone cracking as the questions closed in. The reaction was explosive. Online, entire communities began debating her every move. To some, she was unfairly vilified, a grieving woman being picked apart by strangers on the internet who had no idea what she was going through. To others, she was the prime suspect, and every denial only deepened their conviction that she knew more than she was saying. This clash of perception created a kind of split-screen reality. On one side was Candus Bly, pleading with the public to understand, insisting she had no part in her daughter's disappearance. On the other was a vast audience of online investigators, convinced that her very insistence was suspicious, that if she truly had nothing to hide, she wouldn't need to repeat it so often. Even experts began weighing in. Body language analysts, psychologists, and former investigators were asked to study her interviews. Some pointed out subtle signs they believed could indicate deception: the breaking of her voice, the downward glances, the stiff posture. Others cautioned against reading too much into it, reminding the public that grief looks different on everyone, and that trauma can easily mimic the same behaviors people mistake for guilt. But in the court of public opinion, caution rarely wins. For many, the verdict was already written. They didn't see Candus Bly as a mother fighting for her daughter. They saw someone who might be fighting to keep a secret. And that suspicion only grew louder as the case dragged on with no answers. Every week that passed without a breakthrough was another week for rumors to spread, theories to take hold, and suspicions to deepen. Each time Candus spoke, hoping to clear her name, she seemed only to feed the fire further. Through it all, one haunting truth remained. While the public tore apart every word and gesture, Summer Wells was still missing. During a televised interview, the kind Candus Bly had reluctantly agreed to, the questions at first seemed routine. When did she last see Summer? What was she doing that day? How has life been since the disappearance? But as the minutes ticked by, the tone shifted. The reporter began pressing harder, asking for clarity, for specifics that Candus either didn't seem willing or able to provide. Her answers grew shorter. Her voice, once steady, now cracked under the weight of each word. She repeated the same familiar line, "I didn't do anything to my daughter," but the repetition, instead of convincing the public, had the opposite effect. To some viewers, it didn't sound like a declaration of innocence. It sounded like someone desperately trying to believe their own story. Then came the moment that would define the interview. As the reporter leaned in, pushing for a straight response, Candus's body language shifted. Her shoulders slumped, her gaze fell to the floor, and her lips tightened as though she was swallowing words she couldn't bring herself to say. She hesitated. She paused. And then, with cameras rolling and the nation watching, Candus stood up, turned her back, and walked away from the camera. For millions of viewers, that was the breaking point. Some saw a grieving, broken mother who had simply reached the limit of her emotional endurance. They said it was raw, human, and real, proof of a woman collapsing under unimaginable grief. But others saw something far more damning. They pointed to the timing, the way she avoided eye contact, the suddenness of her exit. To them, it wasn't a breakdown. It was a slip, a crack in the story. The moment when guilt showed itself, not in words, but in silence, in the act of walking away. Experts were quick to weigh in. On Dr. Phil's program, body language analysts dissected every second of the footage. They noted the downward glances, the shaky tone, the defensive posture. They explained how avoidance often signals discomfort, and how silence can sometimes reveal more than speech. Was it grief? Or was it guilt leaking through in the only way it could? And online, the reaction was explosive. Forums lit up with theories, YouTube channels replayed the clip in slow motion, and Facebook groups debated endlessly over what they had witnessed. Some declared it the closest thing to a confession Candus would ever give. Not a confession in words, but in body language. Others pushed back, warning that pain and guilt often look the same when seen through the unforgiving lens of suspicion. But one thing was certain, that moment, Candus walking away from the camera, became one of the most analyzed and debated pieces of footage in the entire Summer Wells case. On Dr. Phil, the atmosphere was nothing short of suffocating. The set, bright and clinical under television lights, offered nowhere to hide. Candus Bly sat in the center, her body language already telling a story before she spoke a single word. For millions watching at home, this wasn't just an interview, it was a cross-examination. The questions were direct, sometimes blunt, echoing the suspicions that had swirled online for months. Dr. Phil pressed her not only about the day Summer disappeared but also about the inconsistencies that had crept into her retelling. At first, Candus tried to hold her ground. She repeated her familiar phrase, "I had nothing to do with this," her voice slightly trembling. But in that studio, surrounded by experts trained to read microexpressions and stress indicators, every flicker of her face carried weight. Body language analysts dissected her demeanor in real time. They slowed down the footage, replaying it frame by frame, drawing attention to subtle details many would have missed. The downward glances whenever Summer's name was spoken, the way her breathing quickened when asked to recall the timeline, the nervous tapping of her fingers on her leg, almost as if she was desperate to channel the tension somewhere, anywhere. To the untrained eye, these might have been dismissed as nerves. But under the microscope of televised scrutiny, they became evidence. Experts pointed out hesitation where certainty should have been, silence where outrage might have cleared the air. When asked about Summer's last known moments, the trip to the basement, the toys, the sudden disappearance, Candus's voice faltered. She looked down, away from her interviewers, as if searching for words that wouldn't come. To analysts, this wasn't just grief. This was avoidance. A telltale sign of internal conflict. Dr. Phil pushed harder, his tone firm, almost prosecutorial. "Are you telling us the full truth? Do you know more than you're letting on?" At that moment, Candus's composure cracked. Tears welled up, her voice caught, and instead of answering, she withdrew. Seconds later, in front of a live studio audience and millions watching from home, she stood up and walked away from the camera. It was a dramatic exit, the kind that instantly becomes the defining image of an interview. For those hoping to see a mother demand justice for her daughter, the sight was jarring. Viewers didn't interpret her leaving as the exhaustion of a grieving woman. Instead, they saw it as confirmation of their darkest suspicions, that under the weight of questioning, Candus Bly couldn't hold her story together. The fallout was immediate. Social media erupted. Hashtags linking Candus's name to guilt surged across platforms. Clips of her walking off set went viral, replayed and reanalyzed by armchair detectives who paused and rewound every frame as though searching for a confession hidden between her movements. For many, it wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say. The silences, the hesitations, the evasions. To the online world, her denials weren't seen as protection. They were seen as cracks, the kind of subconscious admissions a guilty conscience lets slip through body language. She didn't answer because she couldn't, one commenter wrote. Others claimed her reaction was the clearest sign yet that she had been involved all along. The interview, rather than silencing critics, only poured fuel on the fire. Even experts who later commented on the show highlighted the significance of her behavior. They pointed to clusters of stress responses, moments where multiple red flags appeared together. Her eyes darting away, her lips tightening, her shoulders stiffening, her answers delayed. Each of these, taken alone, could be explained as nerves. But stacked together, they painted a different picture. And for Candus, perception became reality. In the court of public opinion, the Dr. Phil interview shifted her image. No longer was she primarily seen as a mother pleading for her missing child's safe return. Instead, she became a central figure of suspicion, someone whose every word and gesture was interpreted through the lens of potential guilt. Yet the reaction wasn't entirely one-sided. A smaller, quieter group raised an uncomfortable counterpoint. Had Candus Bly just been convicted by television? They argued that grief manifests in unpredictable ways, that trauma can distort memory, that body language under stress isn't an exact science. To them, what the world had watched was not a confession but a collapse. The breakdown of a woman drowning in loss, public scrutiny, and relentless suspicion. Still, the dominant narrative held strong. For many, the Dr. Phil appearance was a turning point. It transformed Candus from a grieving mother into a figure to be interrogated, doubted, and dissected. Every subsequent interview she gave was judged against that performance. Every statement was measured for cracks. Every sigh, every downward glance, every pause was framed as another piece of evidence in an ever-growing case that existed more in the public's imagination than in the files of law enforcement. And therein lies the paradox. The very act of trying to clear her name only deepened the suspicion. The harder Candus defended herself, the more people believed she had something to hide. Her tears weren't seen as grief but as guilt. Her denials weren't taken as truth but as rehearsed lines. Her silence wasn't read as exhaustion but as evasion. By the time the episode faded from headlines, one truth remained undeniable. The Dr. Phil interview didn't bring Candus sympathy. It brought judgment. And to this day, that televised moment, her hesitations, her tears, her dramatic exit, remains one of the most hotly debated pieces of the Summer Wells case. And that's the dangerous thing about cases like Summer Wells. When official answers don't come, the public creates its own. And those stories, born from frustration, fear, and grief, often take on a life of their own. They ripple across social media, through message boards, Facebook groups, YouTube channels, even living room conversations among neighbors. And once they spread, they're nearly impossible to contain. In Hawkins County, Tennessee, that storm of speculation has been raging since June 15, 2021. For 3 years, Candus Bly, Summer's mother, has been at the center of it. Every word she speaks, every time she cries on camera, even the moments when she chooses not to speak at all, they've all been dissected, replayed, slowed down, and analyzed like crime scene evidence. To many people, she isn't just the grieving mother of a missing child. She is the prime suspect, whether law enforcement says so or not. Her repeated denials, "I had nothing to do with this. I didn't hurt my daughter," should have been words of reassurance. But for some they weren't. Instead, they sounded like rehearsed lines. Like something said too many times, in too many interviews, to be completely genuine. Online sleuths argue that real innocence doesn't need constant reminders. And so the more she said it, the more guilty she appeared. But then, there's another side. A quieter, less angry group who sees something very different. They see a woman who has lost her daughter, and then, almost overnight, lost her entire sense of privacy, trust, and community. They argue that grief doesn't look the same for everyone. That no one can tell a mother how to react when her 5-year-old vanishes without a trace. Some parents collapse. Some go numb. Some lash out. And some, like Candus, shut down when the spotlight becomes too bright. And that's the split. Two versions of Candus Bly exist in the public imagination. In one version, she's a guilty mother whose actions finally caught up with her. In the other, she's an ordinary woman trapped inside an extraordinary nightmare, condemned by strangers who have never once stood in her shoes. The media hasn't helped. Each appearance on national television only poured gasoline on the fire. When Candus walked out of a live interview, it wasn't seen as grief. It was seen as guilt. When she broke down on Dr. Phil, the hosts and analysts replayed her tears frame by frame, circling her body language, pointing to hesitation, avoidance, and stress as red flags. To millions of viewers, those weren't denials at all. They were confessions in disguise. The kind a guilty person makes when the truth becomes too heavy to carry. And yet, what if those moments were exactly what they looked like? Not strategy, not deception, but raw, unfiltered pain? That's the danger of absence. When answers don't come from investigators, the void is filled with interpretation. When police won't or can't share what they know, the burden shifts to the public, and the public isn't gentle. It isn't always fair. It looks for villains because a story without a villain is too unbearable to process. And in Summer's case, the person in that role became her own mother. But here's the only undeniable truth. Summer Wells is still missing. For all the debates, for all the interviews, for all the accusations. A 5-year-old girl vanished from her home in rural Tennessee, and 3 years later, she has not been found. No arrests, no closure, just questions. So what are we really looking at? A guilty mother, hiding the truth in plain sight? Or a grieving parent, broken by a tragedy and condemned by the court of public opinion? Until Summer is found, suspicion will remain. And maybe that's the hardest part. Because for all of us watching, it feels like every theory has been exhausted, every angle has been examined, and still, we're left staring at the same missing poster. The same little girl's face. The same haunting question. Where is Summer Wells? So, is this really a confession? Or is it something far more complicated? A mother breaking down under the unbearable weight of the world? Every word she speaks, every hesitation, every tear, every sigh carries a story. But whose story is it? Ours? Hers? Or the one the public has already written for her? Because when a child goes missing and the answers are nowhere to be found, the world rushes in to fill the gaps. And those gaps are often filled with judgment, assumption, and fear. What do you hear in her voice? The trembling syllables, the repeated denials, the frustration at the cameras, are they the voice of innocence, pleading to be understood, pleading for people to believe her? Or are they the carefully measured tones of someone hiding a truth too heavy to share, too dangerous to reveal? Every shift in tone, every crack in her voice, every downward glance has been replayed, dissected, and debated millions of times online. To some, her words are proof of innocence. To others, they are a confession in disguise, a subtle admission her mind cannot conceal, even as her lips insist otherwise. And then there's the silence. Those long pauses. The moments when she looks away. The times she simply walks out of frame. Those silences speak louder than any statement. They leave space for the mind to wander, for suspicion to creep in, for theories and accusations to take hold. Is it grief? Is it guilt? Or perhaps it is both, tangled together in a knot that no one outside her experience can untangle. Because the cruel reality is this: no matter how carefully we listen, we still don't know. And that is what makes it so haunting. For years, the world has watched Candus Bly, analyzing her every word, scrutinizing her every gesture, dissecting her expressions frame by frame. Social media forums have exploded with opinion. YouTube channels have replayed clips hundreds of times, slowing them down to read her eyes, her lips, her hands, her posture. To some, every movement is proof. To others, it is merely the visible anguish of a mother trapped in a nightmare she cannot escape. And yet, the one thing that truly matters remains absent: Summer Wells. That little girl is still missing. And in that absence, our minds reach for answers that don't exist. We grasp at meaning in gestures, tones, and silences, because without answers, speculation becomes reality. We ask ourselves, is Candus Bly innocent? Is she guilty? And perhaps most importantly, what is the line between human grief and human guilt? Because grief can look like anger. Anger can look like defensiveness. Defensiveness can look like guilt. And the public sees what it wants to see, often overlooking the subtle nuances of human emotion in favor of simple explanations. So, we are left with a question that refuses to fade. When Candus speaks, when she pauses, when she cries, when she leaves a room without an answer, are we hearing the voice of innocence? Or are we hearing the silence of someone still hiding what really happened to Summer Wells? And until that silence is broken, until concrete answers emerge, the story remains suspended between two impossible truths: the grief of a mother, the suspicion of a world, the absence of a little girl. Every tear, every word, every silence continues to echo. And the question lingers, heavier with every passing day: will we ever know the truth? Or will the world be left only with fragments, guesses, and the haunting echoes of a missing child whose voice can no longer speak for herself? Because at the heart of it all, beyond the speculation, beyond the theories, beyond the analysis and debate, there is one undeniable fact: Summer Wells is still gone. And until she is found, every word, every pause, every silent glance carries with it the unbearable weight of unanswered questions.